I couldn't stand him. From the moment I moved into my new apartment, it felt like we were destined to clash. His name was Alex, and he lived right next door. He had a sharp tongue, a smug look in his eyes, and he always found a reason to complain. We barely knew each other, but he acted like I was the worst neighbor in the world. It all started over something small. I had parked my car a bit too close to his, I'll admit, but I didn't think it was that big of a deal. Then, one day, I found a note on my windshield: "Next time, watch where you park." I was annoyed but tried to brush it off. I didn't even know who had left it until I ran into him in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, with that look of superiority on his face. "You're the one who left that note?" I asked, holding it up. He raised an eyebrow. "Well, your car was practically kissing mine. I figured you needed a reminder." I crossed my arms, glaring back at him. "Or, you could have just knocked on my door and said something, and give you the chance to slam it in my face." "No, thanks," he replied with a smirk. For a moment we just stood there, staring each other down. It was the start of what became an almost daily clash. Every time we crossed paths, it ended in an argument. I'd come home to find a note on my door complaining about noise, even if I'd just been watching TV at a normal volume. If I left my trash out for even a minute too long, he'd let me know about it. It felt like he was just waiting for me to mess up so he could pounce. I thought he was the most arrogant, self-righteous person I'd ever met. But at the same time, I started to notice other things about him. Like how he pushed his hair back when he was frustrated, running his fingers through the strands until they stood up in every direction. Or the way his voice softened when he talked to other people in the building, especially the elderly lady down the hall. It was frustrating, really. I didn't want to notice anything good about him. He was my enemy, plain and simple. Then there was the day with the groceries. I had gone shopping for the first time in weeks, and I was juggling way more bags than I should have been. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door without dropping everything, I heard footsteps behind me. Of course, it was Alec. "Need help?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I've got it," I snapped, just as one of the bags slipped from my grip. Groceries scattered across the hallway, oranges rolling in every direction. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the mess and feeling my face heat up in embarrassment. Then, to my surprise, Alex sighed and set his things down. Without a word, he started picking up the fallen groceries, gathering them back into the bag. "Thanks," I mumbled, not looking at him. He shrugged, handing me the bag. "Don't mention it. But really, you should work on your balance." Despite myself, I laughed. A real laugh. For the first time since our arguments began, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. And just like that, the tension between us eased, if only for a moment. The next few days passed without incident. I almost missed our usual fights, the banter that had become so familiar. But I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd helped me without a second thought. There was a part of him I hadn't seen before, a part I didn't want to acknowledge existed. After that day, things changed, though not entirely. We still argued, but it wasn't as hostile. Sometimes, there was even a hint of humor in our exchanges. He'd knock on my door to complain about something, and I'd fire back with a sarcastic remark. It became less about anger and more like banter. One morning, I woke up to a thud coming from the hallway. Curious, I peeked out and found Alex struggling with a stack of boxes. "Need some help?" I offered, smirking a little. He glanced at me, his expression somewhere between irritation and relief. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, shifting the boxes towards me. We carried them to his door in silence, and for the first time, there was no edge in the quiet. When we finally set the boxes down, he looked at me, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks. I guess you're not completely useless." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the grin that far. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." From that day on, we started talking more, though it was still rough around the edges. We would run into each other in the hallway, sometimes bickering, sometimes not. I found myself noticing the little things like the way he hummed softly when he cooked, the light in his apartment glowing warm in the evenings, the sound of his laughter when he spoke to his friends on the phone. One night, I was taking out the trash when I heard his door open. "Going to the store?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I replied. "Couldn't sleep. Thought some fresh air might help." He hesitated, his hand resting on the door. "Mind if I join?" The question caught me off guard. For a second, I wanted to say no to keep the distance between us. But then I found myself nodding. Sure, why not? The walk to the store was surprisingly comfortable. For once, we didn't argue. Instead, we talked about random things: work, music, the annoying sound the elevator made. It was the first time I had seen a side of Alex that wasn't wrapped in frustration. We strolled down the aisles, picking up random snacks. I watched as he debated over which cereal to get, his brow furrowing in concentration. It was oddly endearing. "You're really taking this seriously," I teased, raising an eyebrow. "Hey, cereal is a crucial decision," he shot back, flashing a grin. "Get it wrong and you've ruined breakfast for the whole week." I laughed, and for the first time, I felt the tension between us melt away. It was strange, this feeling of ease, as if the walls we had built up were slowly crumbling. As we walked back, he turned to me, his expression softer than usual. "You know, I thought you were just another annoying neighbor at first." I chuckled, looking down at the pavement. "Yeah, I thought you were a jerk." He laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Guess we were both wrong." We stopped outside our doors, the air between us feeling different now, charged with something I couldn't quite place. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice losing its usual edge. "Do you want to come over? We could keep talking." My stomach flipped at the suggestion, nerves and excitement mixing together. I nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." That night changed everything. What started as an argument turned into a connection either of us had expected. We stayed up for hours, talking about things we never thought we'd share. He wasn't just the annoying neighbor anymore. He was Alex, someone who, underneath it all, was just as guarded and scared as I was. Our conversations grew deeper. We talked about our pasts, our dreams, and our fears. I learned that Alex had grown up in a small town, had come to the city to escape a life he didn't want. He confessed he had been burned in relationships before, which was why he kept people at arm's length. Hearing him open up like that made me realize how similar we were. I had been running too, hiding behind walls of sarcasm and distance. Days turned into weeks, and our time together grew. We still argued, sure, but now it felt like part of something more. There was a playfulness to it, a warmth that hadn't been there before. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, to hearing his voice. And before I realized it, I had fallen for him. It wasn't smooth. We had our clashes, moments where we'd snap at each other. But every time, we managed to find our way back, to break through the walls we had built. It was as if the arguments were just part of our way of communicating, a way to express what we couldn't put into words. One evening, we were sitting on his couch, a movie playing in the background, neither of us really watching it. He glanced over at me, his face unusually serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, turning to meet his gaze. "Why did you keep fighting with me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Even when I was being an ass?" I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. The room felt charged with unspoken thought. Finally, I sighed and looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Maybe," I began, "because it was easier to fight than to face how you made me feel." His eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he didn't interrupt. "You made me feel things I wasn't ready for," I admitted, my voice growing quieter. "It was easier to argue with you than to admit that I cared." I looked down at my hands, feeling a flush creep up my neck. It was the most honest I had ever been with him, and it terrified me. He didn't speak for a moment, just sat there, processing what I had said. Then he shifted closer to me on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. Same here, he confessed, his voice a little shaky. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to deal with it. He let out a breath, looking down at his hands, mirroring my own nervousness. I've been hurt before, he continued, his eyes still focused on his hands. Getting close to people, it's scary. And you just got under my skin, and I didn't know how to handle it. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. But I don't want to push you away anymore. My heart pounded in my chest. This was the moment I had both feared and hoped for. All the arguments, the sarcastic remarks, the banter, it had all been leading to this. I swallowed, gathering my courage, and reached out to take his hand in mine. His fingers tightened around mine, warm and steady. We don't have to figure everything out right now, I said softly. But I want to try. I want to see where this goes. His face softened, and for the first time, I saw the walls around him come crashing down. From that point on, things changed. We didn't stop arguing completely honestly, that would have been impossible. But the arguments felt different, lighter, almost like a game we played with each other. They became a way of communicating, of pushing each other, of peeling back the layers we had both built up over the years. Some nights, we stayed up late talking, lying on his couch, legs tangled together. He told me about his past relationships, about how he had been afraid to let anyone get too close. I listened, running my fingers through his hair as he talked, feeling a mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for what he had gone through and hope for what we were building together. Other nights we would lie in silence, just holding each other. The quiet moments were just as powerful as the conversations, maybe even more so. They were filled with a kind of intimacy that I had never experienced before, a connection that went beyond words. One day, he surprised me with a key to his apartment. I want you to have this, he said, holding it out to me. In case you ever need to get in when I'm not around. Or if you just want to be here. I stared at the key, a lump forming in my throat. It was such a small object, but it felt monumental. I took it from his hand, feeling its cool weight in my palm. Are you sure? I asked, looking up at him. He nodded, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. Yeah. I want you to feel like this is your place too. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. I leaned in and kissed him, slow and soft, pouring everything I felt into that moment. When we pulled back, his eyes were shining with something I couldn't quite place. Thank you, I whispered, for trusting me. As weeks turned into months, our lives began to intertwine in ways I hadn't imagined. We started cooking dinner together, sharing stories of our day, and laughing at each other's ridiculous habits. He complained about how I left my socks lying around, and I teased him about his obsession with organizing the kitchen. That it was all part of the rhythm. We had created a rhythm that felt right. One evening, as we sat on his balcony, sipping wine and watching the sunset, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about the future? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated, not sure where he was going with this. Sometime, I admitted. Why? Are you worried about something? He shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. No, not worried. Just thinking. He glanced at me, his eyes searching mine. I think I want you to be a part of my future. My heart skipped a beat, the words sinking in slowly. It was such a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it. I want that too, I said, my voice steady. More than anything. That conversation marked a new chapter for us. We started making plans together, not just for the weekend, but for the months and years ahead. We talked about traveling, about what it would be like to move to a new place together someday. The idea scared me a little, but it also excited me. For the first time, I could see a future that wasn't just mine but ours. There were still challenges, of course. We had our fights, our moments of doubt and frustration. There were days when we both retreated into our shells, afraid of getting hurt. But every time, we found our way back to each other. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. One of the hardest moments came a few months later. He got a call from his family, telling him they wanted to visit. I could see the anxiety in his eyes, the fear that they wouldn't accept us, that they would judge our relationship. "Do you think I'm ready for this?" he asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. I pulled him close, wrapping my arms around him. "You don't have to be ready," I said softly. "We'll face it together, no matter what happens." He nodded, burying his face in my shoulder. For a moment, I felt the weight of his fear, the vulnerability he was showing me. It made me realize just how much he trusted me, how far we had come. When his family arrived, the tension was palpable. But I stood by his side, holding his hand as he introduced me. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkward silence, of strained smiles. But gradually things began to ease. They saw how much we cared for each other, how happy we made each other. By the time they left, it felt like a weight had been lifted. "Thank you," he said that night, his voice choked with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." I kissed him, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "We're in this together," I whispered. "Always." That was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that we had saved each other. What started as a clash between two stubborn neighbors had turned into something neither of us had expected. We had peeled back each other's defenses, navigated the rough waters of our fears and doubts, and found something real on the other side. As we lay in bed that night, tangled in each other's arms, I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't that everything was perfect, it never would be. But we had each other, and that was enough. "We've come a long way," he murmured sleepily, his breath warm against my neck. I smiled, closing my eyes as I held him close. "Yeah, we have," I replied. "And we've got a long way to go. But we'll get there. Together."